Hey,
You made it. Did it.
made it. Yeah.
Look how easy that was. One test run.
How are you?
I'm well. I'm well. We got a little slight technical situation tonight, but it's gonna be fine. Usually I do this on Men Healing's Instagram, but
Mhm.
unfortunately I'm not able to log into their account for some reason. So we got to figure out how that's going. But other than that, I'm great. This is like
Good.
the cutoff day for me. Like I'm done until after January, and I'm
Oh,
gonna make
nice.
a vow to do that. Because
Nice.
we do this stuff, we do this work that's really heavy, emotionally laborious work to
Mm-hmm.
support people's healing journey, to share our stories, to just offer so much of ourselves to others. And so, um, I'm looking forward to having a break, and I'm also looking forward to having this conversation with you.
I'm
How you
looking
doing?
forward to that as well.
Yeah,
And I
yeah.
know that feeling of, all my work has been one way or another. It's always been about trauma healing, helping,
Hmm.
growing,
Hmm.
learning,
Hmm.
um, and then trying to kind of stay revitalized as well.
Yes, yes. So you know what? Why don't we start there? Why don't you? I'll just let folks know that like this conversation here is typically done on Men Healings on Instagram, but I'm doing it on mine for some technical reasons, and this is still like an opportunity for you to donate as we, continue this campaign to raise 90,000 by 90 days, and we have about
Yeah.
10 days left, so we're in the home stretch, and we're at about $51,000. So there's still a long way to go. And like
Mm-hmm.
I've said multiple times, this is really just like an opportunity to support the work of Men Healing, who are committed to creating space and community for male survivors of sexual violence and sexual harm. And they do that work in a way that is not just focused on the trauma, but focused on the healing, and
Mm-hmm.
focused on really allowing folks to be in community with others who see them for their experiences, but not as their experiences, especially the experiences of harm and trauma.
Mm-hmm.
And tonight I have a guest, Deborah Daniels, who is joining me, who's also affiliated with Men Healing, as many of the other guests that I've had on the IG lives have been. So Deborah, just tell folks a little bit about you, about the work you've done, and the way that you found yourself connected to Men Healing.
Well, I'm a licensed clinical social worker
Hmm.
um, since 1984.
Hmm.
And I have all the work that I've done in some way has been working within the community,
Hmm.
um, addressing issues that some folks don't see the value of the kind of work that goes into some of the folks that I've worked with, and it's just
Hmm.
been every every job I've taken from the first one out has made me feel more and more committed.
Hmm.
Important
Hmm.
to be able to do that kind of work. So I started out working with foster kids in
Okay.
my very first job as a social worker, and my caseload was much heavier of young men. But I worked with all the different communities in the area in Ogden, Utah, where I grew up. Um, and then when I went back to graduate school, I found myself just seeing so many ways that people could be assisting. I started out in elementary ed, and I didn't quite have that feeling, but when I got to social work, it
Hmm.
just seemed to be the place for me, and I loved it. My first job was working with adolescent girls
Hmm.
who were either just out of or trying not to go into incarcerated to be incarcerated as young adolescents in the the detention centers.
Mm-hmm.
And that what I began to learn there, because Salt Lake is a little different than Ogden, but there are so many people who were um, trying to really kind of find the ways to kind of to help folks. And and when I was in Ogden, it was the same, but I worked primarily in a African American community at that point. And
Mm-hmm.
then it kind of moved and shifted. Um, I spent 11 years at the YWCA working with domestic violence.
Mm-hmm.
And then I spent the next 3 years at the Rape Recovery Center. The last 17 years I spent at the University of Utah Women's Resource Center. And we
Mm-hmm.
worked with such a broad range of folks. And so for me in this work, so much of it has been primarily focused on women.
Mm-hmm.
In that, however, I found myself doing work with all kinds of folks.
Mm-hmm.
We got a grant to do some works on healthy relationships, and we started working. I started my own little business that I was doing on the side, and that was pretty exciting for me to be working with men who had been arrested for soliciting sex.
Mm-hmm.
And so my business partner and I put together a class and worked with that population for a little over 10 years, along with my full-time work.
Mm-hmm.
And also brought in different folks to start working with us and facilitating those classes, bringing men into the class with us to co-facilitate. People of color, a lot of people of color, a lot of diversity in that. And so that was, for me, that was really important work to think about. It also, for me, was some of the work that I did, because another place I worked at was a place in just north of Salt Lake, and I worked with young boys who were, or boys and young men who were in facility for sexual violence and sexual perpetration. And there's a lot of work in understanding them and where they were and what they did, and also looking at the humanity behind
Mm-hmm.
everyone that we work with.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it really allowed me to kind of see and know them in one way, but it also allowed me to go into the next job I had, which was work at the Rape Recovery Center, talking to women about, who had for years blamed themselves, and then talking about what happens with victim grooming. And then, of course, in that process with those young men, I found that they were victimized way before I saw them. So you see how that chain just kind of gets tangled up and knotted up. Um, so so anyway, that just is kind of, so from all of that, I've worked with a broad range of folks.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm excited to be working with Men Healing. I think that in the work that I've done everywhere, there's always been men that we've worked with. And even at the Women's Resource Center, I love the fact that we worked with all students on campus who wanted to come there for services. Some preferred to come there. I also felt really good about the folks who would come to see us who were identifying as trans, and did a lot of work with my staff for us to really be able to kind of work and embrace that. And it was great work with a great team of folks.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, one, thank you for all the work that you've done, and, this is unfortunately, my grandmother used to say this. My grandmother started a nonprofit in 1974 that worked with folks who were HIV positive. And she also worked, she just did so much. She started a community school and like a food pantry. I feel like back then it was just like realizing that there was so many needs in our community. And
Mm-hmm.
and she was one of those people, Lynn Carr, I'll say her name, affectionately known as Miss Bunny, She just knew that there needed to be so many things done to support our people because of all of the things that we were facing, systemically, socially, politically, in ways that denied us access to the resources and the opportunities that we truly needed to strive, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
you know, for so much of our history as Black and Brown people in this country, it's been about survival. It's
Yeah.
been about maintaining. It's been about just getting by.
Mm-hmm.
And so she understood early on. But anyhow, one of the things that she used to say to me was that, you know, this is a thankless profession,
Mm-hmm.
right? The work that we do is thankless. And oftentimes, many of us are driven by something that has happened to us, things that we've experienced, or the things that people that we've loved have experienced directly. And it
Mm-hmm.
creates this like an intrinsic motivation and it's like visceral response to the suffering and hurt of others that, you know, produces this sense of empathy. And, you know, one of the things that you were saying, as I was just listening to all the work that you've done, knowing that you've been doing this work since, you know, the 80s, you know, where we're at now, and this is something that I'm really grateful about younger folks today because they're really being committed to this concept. I know Kara Page was the first person that I've known to talk about this concept of healing justice, and
Mm-hmm.
essentially what it is like while we're trying to support other people's healing and create the world that we want to live in on a systemic level, there simultaneously needs to be an equal commitment to healing ourselves throughout this process because we are not like exempt. We have been impacted by these same issues on a personal level as well as systemically. We've been impacted by these same issues. So I'm curious. Just this is kind of like off the script a little bit, but for you know, young therapists and social workers and people who are doing this work, can you share a little bit about like what were your healing justice practices? What were the things that you did personally that allowed you to do this work sustainably for so long? Because you truly are an elder and you are someone that we, you know, we need to turn to for wisdom because unfortunately many of us don't have access to folks who have been committed to this work for as long as you have. So what would you like to share with people who are
Well,
doing this
first,
work?
thank you for that.
Mm,
I agree with you.
mm,
Um, that piece about self-care,
mhm,
you know, I think in one of the pieces of information that I had just sent to Jim, I was looking at it, and I remember I was co-facilitating a group for women of color on campus, and you know, we talked about a lot of ways of that in that process of kind of dealing with what they were dealing with. There's this other piece of you have to take care of yourself,
mhm,
and I would share some of the things that I would do. Like I when I first started my profession, I you know I my parents were living, and I spent a lot of time um, just kind of spending with them, you know,
mhm,
so that because I was the only girl in this household of six kids,
mm,
and I knew that probably at some point that was going to be something that was going to be paramount for me to be able to be kind of close to them. Leaving time to do that, um, having a good friendship network, uh, music,
mm,
uh, allowing myself to try some new things along the way, you
mhm,
know, and like I started to golf, you know,
mhm,
and found I was an athlete, but I kind of mocked golf when I was in high school, like golf,
mhm.
you
That's not a
know.
sport.
but
Anybody do that, right?
then I loved it. It connected me to a different set of folks,
Mhm,
and I also think that I always tell people when you're working in something that is intense like that,
mhm,
make sure that you have a team around you that you that do things better than you, that
mhm,
do things that you don't do.
mhm,
Because what happens with that, they get to rise in their skill. And like there are people I just knew, if I'm going to be out of town, these folks here, they got it. and I
Mm-hmm.
didn't worry about it.
Mm-hmm.
But when I first started out as a manager, I was trying to make sure everybody, had their support, but I wasn't looking at my support.
Right.
And you begin to feel that.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think about those kinds of things. When I decided, so I just recently retired. It'll be 2 years at the end of June. In that first year, I just I didn't do much of anything.
Mm-hmm.
I did a little bit of some social justice work with a couple of professors that I am real close with.
Mm-hmm.
But I have just kind of been taking it easy. Spent time up in Ogden with my aunt, who will be 82 soon, and she's running the Northern Coalition of Utah HIV and AIDS Center. Uh, After retiring from 2 other jobs. So I go and spend time with her because we both know that sense of just kind of being busy and taking care of yourself. So I try to go up and do that with her. I have a brother
Mm-hmm.
up there, some cousins. So I go up there occasionally, and I try to be really mindful
Mm-hmm.
about trying to get out and walk, trying to kind of connect with people, particularly now that I'm not working, so that I have this connection of folks I talk to. And there's some folks who, now that I'm not working, I go and I see them, and I might take them something to eat, or I might go and just sit and visit. But I try to have this cycle of just kind of connecting. It's healing for me, and I know
Mm-hmm.
it feels good to them, but it's healing for me too. And I've worked with some folks who are they were amazing.
Yeah. Wow.
So,
Yeah, I appreciate that, and I'm sure others are going to appreciate that. Well, your niece is saying hi, Auntie. I also have to shout out my brother, who is a social worker in DC School District, and
mhm,
my dear friend Ricky Rivera, aka Ricky Bats, who's a hip hop artist,
mhm,
someone who actually served time with me, and so I'm really grateful for you sharing that information. One of the things that I say to therapists and social workers and folks who I've had the privilege to work with over the years is like, we can only heal to the level of our healing, right? And so,
mhm,
like,
right,
oftentimes when we're frustrated and challenged by people, they're either like triggering something in us or like, helping us to see some things that we haven't dealt with ourselves, especially those of
mhm,
us who come into this work with our own experiences of interpersonal trauma and
mhm,
just recognition of like the systemic trauma that we've experienced.
mhm,
Um, but what you said that really resonated was just the importance of connection and relationship. And I know when we talked originally, you shared about your work with males who had been survivors. Because the other thing that we know is right, like there isn't anyone who causes harm who has not experienced harm, right? We know that hurt people, right? And
right.
we know that people who are on their healing journey can help other people heal as well. And so, what I heard you say is that your work was really around creating community to kind of diminish this sense of
Mhm,
isolation that
mhm,
those of us who've experienced harm and who cause harm tend to find ourselves in.
mhm,
And you created this community for men that allowed them to share their stories. As someone who's formerly incarcerated and was like thirsty and yearning for
mhm,
those experiences and opportunities behind the wall, just to share my experiences and really to say to people like what happened to me, right? Because
mhm,
that's a big shift in the trauma work, right? Like what's wrong with you shifted to what happened to you. And
right.
like those communities, those spaces that were created by the outside volunteers allowed me to really share about what happened to me. And in the midst of that process, it kind of diminished that sense of isolation and the
Mhm.
shame that can like emerge from that isolation. Can you talk a little bit about your storytelling work with the men that you work with, some of the
You know,
stories you heard, and
as
like, yeah.
Yeah, well, like as you're saying, one of the things that I'm thinking as I'm hearing you talk about it, for a man to go out and say that they had been abused or violated in some kind of way, that in and of itself was going to keep them kind of holding that inside, because it's not okay to say that someone molested me, someone, violated me in some way or another as a man, and I think
Mm-hmm.
I saw that a lot in terms of when we were working with some of the men, and and these classes were all male. And it was interesting that as we were doing that work with them, they would come in kind of, I'm just going to sit and I'll sit through this 10 weeks. But what we started to do is each class was held once every 10 weeks. So whenever you come in, that's where you start. And there's a starting point for that. So the men who now are 4 weeks past that, and this guy's coming in saying, "Oh, this is BS. I don't want to be doing this shit." Well, then they
Mm-hmm.
come in and they became the ones to say, "No, it's okay," because we would start every class with the feelings check in, and they're like,
Yeah.
"What?"
Yeah.
And then after a while, they came in red. They were like, "Where's the feeling bag? I got to get my feelings
Mm-hmm.
ready," you
Mm-hmm.
know. And you begin to see when there's a freedom to be able to own that, talk about that, to say, this week I felt great. I went home, I told my wife about this class I'm in. I told her why I got into it. I
Mm-hmm.
just, I had to do that, you
Mm-hmm.
know. And then another person might say, I don't know if I could tell anybody that I'm in this class, because of, soliciting sex without having then to talk about what happened.
Mm-hmm.
And also watching accountability come around, because
Yeah.
it come in kind of early on. I was noticing when certain people, guys would come in, it would be part of this piece around, you know, um, wanting just to kind of put it behind them and not be able to kind of discuss what had happened to them. And if they did, they didn't know what to do with those feelings. And so they either ended up saying that they were drinking, or they'd go out and look for more women to have sex with, and they were, guarded and protective of themselves,
Mm.
but they weren't happy.
Yeah.
you know, and they didn't know how to have those conversations, and they didn't know that a group of guys would even want to.
Yeah.
And so, in the 10 years of doing this class, watching people come in who were really wealthy to people who
Mm.
were coming in just running to get to class without the door getting locked on them, from a place, because they had to walk or catch the bus in, or they
Mm-hmm.
were had to run to get the bus to get there and hope to get there in time. And so there's all those kind of pieces, but they'd come in and they would just kind of, sit back. And once they started to watch the other people who were there and getting close to finishing the class, and seeing them kind of in this kind of a role where there was work that my business partner and I were doing with them, but there was work that the men were doing with them. I think I told you about the guy whose dog was killed,
Mm-hmm.
or I might have told that to Jim, but um, he he said that he wanted to cry, but his boys were there and his kids were there, and these guys just wrapped around him and talked to him, and and he said it brought up all kinds of things where I wasn't kind, where I
Mm-hmm.
wasn't able to be sympathetic, you
Mm.
know.
Mm.
And so you deal with these full range of emotions and the intensity of it. Um, and then, sometimes at the end of the class, you don't know what they're going to say. And they're just saying, why didn't I get a class like this when I was 15?
Yeah.
Why didn't I
Yeah. No,
get a space like this, when I was 17,
yeah. Yeah.
So,
Yeah. No,
yeah.
you're touching. I mean, you're hitting home. And one, I want to thank you for that work. I know 10 years is a long time to be committed to doing that work. And so that's something that I really am grateful for. The other thing you're touching on for me is just like the way that patriarchy impacts us as men. And I don't think we really think about that, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
patriarchy creates this really constricted, confined identity formation that doesn't allow us
Mm-hmm.
to express the full range of emotions that are just human, that are just natural of every human. And as men, we're as a denial of that, we suppress it,
Mm-hmm.
right? And oftentimes it comes up in ways that are, that are excessive and extreme and that are harmful of others. And then that's ultimately reinforced,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
so, that's the conundrum too that we need to think about, as feminist allies, as men who are committed
Mm-hmm.
to healing from the impact of patriarchy on ourselves. And then the other thing you help me to think about too is like in our society that is a meritocracy, right?
Mm-hmm.
That is much, right? Like the spaces that you've created, they were spaces that were rooted in grace. And I think that's oftentimes what's missing in our
Yeah.
society,
Mm-hmm.
grace.
Mm-hmm.
My colleague Bree Baker said something earlier today that, like in the abolitionist movement spaces, they have a phrase that like you move at the speed of trust, and
Mm-hmm.
so that trust that I'm not going to be judged, I'm not going to be
Mm-hmm.
condemned
Mm-hmm.
without showing any grace. And like accountability is a part of that process. You can show grace and hold a
Mm-hmm.
person accountable.
Yes.
Um, but that accountability does not have to come with condemnation, and it does not have to come with punishment. And I think oftentimes we conflate accountability with punishment,
Mm-hmm.
whereas accountability should be a process that's rooted in healing, that's
Yeah.
guided by grace, and a
Mm-hmm.
way that it creates a space for us to really start to look at some of the things that happened to us, like you shared tonight, and the way that those things impacted us and how they've contributed to us and causing harm to other people, people that we love, people that we care about, and that produces this state of isolation and shame that
Mm-hmm.
doesn't allow us to heal, that keeps
Mm-hmm.
us just trying to get by, and put it behind us without really doing the work. And
Yeah.
that work is hard.
It is hard. And I think for me what shifted that is as we were working and doing this work and working with these gentlemen, there was watching this shift and this change, you know, and watching them then begin to kind of say, I don't feel as horrible
Yeah,
as I did before about why I'm here. I
yeah,
just want to know how not to go back there,
yeah,
you know.
yeah,
Um, I also think that um, humanity, you know, like you say, if they came in and we just wanted to belittle them or shame them or ridicule them, they'd have just been tapping their foot waiting to get out. But it's like you know how because you're a little more tense today.
yeah, yeah.
George is my son had a birthday and I didn't have $1 to buy him a present. By the time the class was over, I think he had like $23 that guys from
Mm-hmm.
around the table gave him to
Mm-hmm.
go buy his son a T-shirt.
Mm-hmm.
You know, um, when that kind of thing begins to happen, I think they're surprised initially, but then they're like you were saying, it's like, well, what? Why do we have to be so hard? You know,
Yeah, yeah.
you hear people talk about, yeah, I'm hard. You know,
Mm-hmm.
I'm the mother of sons. I have two sons. You
Mm-hmm.
know, and they're very, very different. But what they can do is they can communicate
Yeah,
and they cannot communicate because they're impacted by me and being raised in a home, but they're also impacted by having to survive out in that world,
yeah.
and having to talk to your kids, and they're grown. I mean, they're 30 and 35, but
Mm-hmm.
I see some of their struggles,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and so I would come home from my class sometimes, and I would just look at them and just think, you know, I'm not the one to have certain conversations with them, but how do young men get those conversations? Because I see what happened to these other men, and it's
Yeah.
like, wow, you know,
Mm-hmm.
um, in a certain environment, they can begin to see the king in them,
Yeah.
um, and the wounded person in them, in themselves, and how to think about that being an asset to the relationships that they care about.
Yeah.
And then for themselves to take care of themselves, that self-care has to go around that whole loop and that whole circle. Not just me getting self-care, but talking about them, what did you do good for yourself this week?
Mm-hmm.
You know, what kind of fun did you have this week? How was everybody's holiday? You know,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
um, and where did you fall short?
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. Yeah. And that's the piece. I mean, I love that hashtag Black Boy Joy. Um,
Mm-hmm.
because I think, and this is something that I've experienced in my work, and I was really committed to, is like shifting the narrative in a way that we're not just talking about Black trauma, right? And that's what's
Mm-hmm.
so dope about men healing, because they're not just talking about male trauma, they're talking about healing, and they're
Yeah.
talking about the joy that can come from the healing that allows us to, like, move beyond some of the painful experiences and the trauma that we've had in the past
Mm-hmm.
that really blocked us, right? That hedonism, right? That denies us and blocks us from having the ability to experience the joy that is all
Mm-hmm.
natural, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
we're stuck in a space where we're just looking to survive, but joy is possible. Joy is a possibility, and so is healing a possibility. And I
Right.
think too often we don't take that into consideration with our black boys, our black men,
Mm-hmm.
because of all of this thing. And that's why I say patriarchy. When we talk about dismantling patriarchy, and like uprooting patriarchy, this is not just a process that should be done by, feminists, by women. This should be done by men too, because we don't understand the impact that it's had on our lives
Mm-hmm.
and the ways that it's denied our, access to the full range of emotions and experiences. That is all, this should be a part of the human experience.
Yeah.
Not just like the harm that it causes, but like the way that it causes harms by denial, not just
Mm-hmm.
by the perpetration or like, the actual act of harming someone else. And
Mm-hmm.
so, I'm really grateful for the work that you've done. I hope to be someone to try to continue on that legacy of doing the work that you've done. One of the things that my dear friend Dr. Bruce Purnell and I have started as a space called, Black Men Grieve. And what we do is we meet weekly to create space for men to come together and just talk about, it doesn't always have to be about grief and like things that we've lost. But I
Mm-hmm.
think that's a good starting point, because
Yeah.
oftentimes we don't think about the ways that loss, even something that might seem like not as serious. When we think of grief,
Mm-hmm.
we oftentimes think of murder and someone dying, but
Mm-hmm.
losing a dog. I've had spaces where a man has talked about, this is a 70-year-old man talked about, who had spent 36 years in prison. And he talked about the pivotal moment in his life being when he had his bike stolen.
Mm-hmm.
And the grief that he felt, well, he was denied the ability to grieve that
Mm-hmm.
loss of that bike. And he was
Mm-hmm.
actually pushed into a predicament where it was like, you need to defend yourself and get that bike back.
Yeah.
And that put him on a trajectory that
Go
was
kick
a part of
somebody.
that: kick somebody's ass, get that
Yeah.
bike back. And it denied him the opportunity to express the sadness that he felt as a little boy for losing something, and how that plays a role in all
Yeah.
of these other behaviors that lead to this pipeline or this trajectory that ends him up in prison for so many years.
Well, as you say that, and it takes me back to talking about, the patriarchy and how these guys have to kind of be so bravado, and looking at them when we would do this whole 1 week would be a week of the act like a man in the man box, and what does
Mm-hmm.
that give you, and what does it take from you, and then what about women? What do we expect from women?
Mm-hmm.
Act like a lady box, and just seeing that they get it, and they might like when their buddies are around to be a little softer with their family, a little more loving, but they go back to them and they don't want to carry that thing like somehow you're whipped. You're a wimp. You know, look at you. You just following the ride, your nose wide open. You know, tell you you don't want to go, and then let's go fishing. You know what I mean? How do you know all of that? But that paradigm, and I've done it with classes when my boys were in school. The little act like a sandbox and little, you know, they know it. They know they know it. They know what's I mean, already by the time they're in third, fourth, fifth grade, they know it.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
how do we allow them to be kind and compassionate and strong and athletic and poetic and, you know, ability to sing whatever their thing is without having to lose their whole self, you know, and just try to uh, have this hard self presented. And then only in certain places will they allow themselves to be compassionate and gentle and loving and kind and, you know, kiss your mom goodbye when you get out the car to go to school, you know. I mean, it's all of those things. Or your dad.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or your dad.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, the time is over. I told you it would go by fast, right?
Yeah,
Look at
yeah,
this.
it did.
But I want to leave a moment of silence for because you just made me think of her Bell Hooks, who was so instrumental in
Mm,
my development, my transformation. I'm thinking of A Will to Change, Men, Masculinity, and Love, and the impact that that book had on my life.
mhm.
And not only, I read that book both in a maximum security prison and at a university in my doctoral program. And so Bell Hooks has been with me throughout my journey and my transformation, my healing process. So I just want to give a moment of silence for Bell Hooks. We can't forget that sister. And then I also just want to thank you. Thank you for everything that you've done so far. I'm so excited to be working with you. For those who are watching, Deborah's going to be joining the board for Men Healing. And so I'm sure there's going to be so many ways that you're going to contribute to the expansion and the work that we're doing around helping male survivors heal from sexual trauma and sexual violence and harm. Um, have
Thank
a
you.
happy holiday.
I will. You do the same. I look
Take care.
forward to seeing you and I could give you a hug.
All right. Take
Well,
care.
if it warrants, you know,
Put the mask.
but even if it's just a virtual, thank you
Yeah,
so much, Richard.
you're welcome. Take care.
All righty.
Bye.
Bye
Bye.
bye.